So welcome everybody. This is part of our MWI's, the Modern War Institute at West Point's War Council series. Our War Councils are intended to bring top flight expertise for analysis and contextualization of important global security events. Today's panel topic was being planned long before the events of the last week or so. We very much wanted to do a 50-year retrospective on lessons learned from the 1973 Arab-Israeli or Yom Kippur War as an important case study for modern LSCO operations. Obviously, we are going to also be touching on some current events, but we have a great panel of historians and strategists here today who will be able to provide some of that background. They'll each be talking for 10 to 15 minutes or so, and then we are going to open it up for Q&A about anything you'd like related to the 1973 war, history, contemporary operations and conflicts. We're really happy to have you all here. So just to begin, to my left we have Dr. Jacob Stoyle, who is the Chair of Applied History at the Modern War Institute and an Associate Professor of Military History at the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. He's a Senior Fellow of the 40th Infantry Division Urban Warfare Center, Assistant Director of the Second World War Research Group North America, and a founding member of the International Working Group on Subterranean Warfare. Going down the line, we then have Dr. Eric Burke, who is a historian and staff ride instructor at Army University Press and Combat Studies Institute at the Combined Arms Center on Fort Leavenworth. He's also a former NCO with deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan. His research interests range widely across the study of armed conflict, with a forthcoming book with Army University Press, Siren Songs, The Perils of Interwar Military Escapism, which juxtaposes stories from the interwar German Reichswehr and post-Vietnam U.S. Army. We also have Dr. Kate Tietzen-Wisdom, who is a historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. She is writing the Army's official history on operations in Iraq between 2009 to 2011, documenting the transition from Operation Iraqi Freedom to Operation New Dawn, and finally to the eventual withdrawal. She has a forthcoming chapter on Iraqi conscription policies with the University of Kansas Press and is working on another book on the Iraqi Ba'ath Party's diplomatic corps and foreign operatives. And last but not least, we have Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Jennings, who is an Army strategist and associate professor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He also has previously taught history here at the U.S. Military Academy, is a graduate of the School of Advanced Military Studies, and holds a PhD in history from the University of Kent. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for joining us. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Stoyle.
Thank you, Max. Thank you also to Major Caitlin Lee for fielding lots and lots of last-minute questions and RFIs. I can honestly tell you nothing here would have happened without her.
Absolutely.
Thank you also for Colonel Sullivan for giving your blessing for this and supporting this. And thank you, General Robinson, for hosting us here. There are two members of our panel who are not here and were not announced. Originally, there was going to be representatives from the ground forces of the IDF and from the IDF Historians Branch, as well as support from the IDF Liaison Unit. Unfortunately, all of those individuals are engaged in operations currently. I've been in touch with some of them, they're all right for now, but have been heavily engaged and lost people. So I'll ask if we could take just a minute to quietly reflect on the fact that we are missing colleagues here today due to the ongoing war. Thank you. The ongoing war actually gives us an entree to what we're going to talk about today. When we, as the US military, look at wars from other countries, we tend to look at it through the perspective of what we want to see, less what is happening on the ground. We draw our lessons from that perspective, and we move forward from that perspective. So 50 years later, what is the relevance of talking about the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War? I submit to you, there's a lot. And part of that is because it's a case of two military structures, or actually multiple as we'll hear, military structures that are not like our own, fighting each other in a major war with relatively modern equipment. And if we take that from a starting point, there are many lessons we can draw out about command culture, leadership, structures, mission command, and a host of other things. It's also relevant because it spiraled from a fairly local engagement very rapidly to a regional conflict, and then one with global implications as well as global participation. Probably my favorite example of this is the moment the North Korean Air Force is now expeditionary and is flying as part of the Egyptian force. Right, so when I say global implications, I mean literally to the point that you have North Korea, and I believe it is their only expeditionary operation in their military history, but I'm not a Korean specialist. We can learn something from the dynamics of that on the strategic level and how that happened. We can learn about joint forces from this war. It's the first missile-on-missile engagement and only missile-used engagement in naval history. Also happens in this war. There are lessons to be learned for those who process intelligence and for those who collect it, for those who lead in the field and for those who are sustainers. But none of these lessons can be learned until the myths are dispelled. We should learn from the realities of the war and not its myths. And that really is the genesis of this panel. Now, what we're going to be missing today, due to the lack of Israeli participation, is they've run a phenomenal lessons learned project over the last 2 years preparing for the 50th anniversary, involving dozens of historians and military officers, involving all of their professional military education institutions, all of their lessons learned, and all of their doctrine institutions. That's something for a future date. There's also been an extraordinary level of declassification that they were going to premiere to us about some of the new things that should come out from that declassification. And we'll be able to talk through some of that, but not the huge wealth of information that has come out. Before we move on to the rest of the panelists, for those who aren't necessarily familiar, it's worth taking a moment to give a brief outline of the 1973 war. The Israeli military system that went into this war is very, very, very different from the assumptions we have of what makes a good military. By culture, it was intentionally unprofessional. Those things that we think of professionalism were almost a dirty word. The concepts we may have of martial bearing down to things like no hands in your pockets, no umbrellas, etc., you would not find in the IDF of the period. In fact, the opposite. The sloppier a unit looked, more likely the better it was. And this is because they come from a different system. The IDF is built on the basis of, at the time, of two principal identities. One is that of special operations. Almost all of the IDF leaders had their first taste of war as part of the British Special Operations Executive in the Second World War. So, to put it in American modern terms, if you had a bunch of Delta people go and say, hey, design a military. The second thing is that population was also radically socialist. And so in its very early days, it had no rank structure. Indeed, by the 73 war, command is still based on function and not rank. So your authority comes purely from the function you fill, not from what rank you wear. This means that a lieutenant can command a brigade, if need be, with no real heartburn of that, and they're not called lieutenant. At the time, Israel has no word for yes sir or yes ma'am. It is only yes commander. And typically, you don't even say that, especially during operations. Everything is on a first name basis throughout. And we'll talk possibly about some of the effects this has. The second thing to understand is the war-fighting part of the Israeli army was not its active, and actually today still remains not its conscript and active force. It's its reserve force. At the time of the 1973 war, the reserve force is full of people who have World War II experience, 1948 experience, 1967, 1956. If you were a combat soldier, you continued to do reserve force service through the age of 55 at the period. In addition to that, there was a heavy belief in organic crews. So if you were a tank driver, for any people thinking branching armor or who have branched armor here, if you were a tank driver, you stayed a tank driver for your entire active service and then your entire reserve service. You generally stayed with the same tank crew as well, with the same gunner, loader, and commander. This gives a huge level of individual soldier proficiency, which is the last thing to understand about the structure they went to war with. It's one based, first and foremost, on the idea that officers and commanders lead rather than command, and trust in the very basic level of subordinate. So in a battalion, armored battalion engagement, the first tank would be the armored battalion commander, trusting that the soldiers of that unit understood what the mission was and could fulfill it very fine without the commander, within the parameters, and that the commander's job was to inspire and lead. So a rather different system, perhaps, than we would think about of the US of the same period. On October 6th, Egypt and Syria joint invaded. Egypt had on the front just over 100,000 soldiers crossing the line of departure against an Israeli position of just over 500 soldiers, not 500,000. On the Golan front, Israel had around 3,000 soldiers, 180 of tanks, and 60 artillery pieces, and they were faced with 3 plussed-up Syrian infantry divisions with large armor components, roughly 28,000 Syrian troops in that first wave, with 800 tanks, 600 artillery pieces, which were followed on immediately by 2 full armor divisions that had been each plussed up with extra brigades, and, talking about that regional spiral, a Moroccan army brigade as well took part in the initial invasion. So what happens on that initial invasion? Well, in the Syrian front, it goes initially well in the south. On the Egyptian front, it goes well across the board. However, in the northern part of the Golan, one understrength Israeli armored brigade defeats, over the course of 2 days, 2 full Syrian divisions. In the southern Golan, the Syrians are forced to stop and reorganize because of this, but also because of a force of 2 tanks who understand that their radio codes are likely broken and call themselves a task force under the one officer named Svika, who will fight for several days before developing severe post-trauma. But the action of that small unit manages to destabilize the Syrian offensive and help forces them to reorganize and pause. By October 11th, the Israeli military has transitioned on the Syrian front, so 5 days later, to a successful counteroffensive that will carry them across the Golan Height and into Syria. The situation becomes so dire that by October 14th, Egypt renews its general offensive to try to take pressure from the Syrian front, fearing a defeat in detail. Syria puts out a request, and Iraq and Jordan join the war. On October 16th, 2 days later, the Israelis have sufficiently stabilized the Syrian front that they transfer the bulk of their combat power back to the Egyptian front and cross the Suez Canal. This replaced a planned offensive amphibious operation across the Gulf of Suez, for which the Navy had already cleared all Egyptian naval forces out of the Gulf of Suez and destroyed coastal defenses. So they were crossing one way or another by this point. It just happens the canal crossing becomes available instead of the amphibious operation. The crossing is so successful that in all but one route completely isolates the entirety of the Egyptian force in Sinai and cuts them off from resupply within the next 2 days. From October 16th through October 28th, you get the battle for the ceasefire. Israel continues to consolidate its position, moving into the suburbs of Damascus. We can talk about the strategic negotiation that happens as part of war during this period. And Egypt and Israel try to establish a ceasefire. So that's a rough outline of what happens in the war. And as I said, there's a lot of mythology around the war, a lot of bad historical takes that were drawn. One is this idea of intelligence failure and fundamental surprise. Some of you will have or will, in your careers, read a book called Fundamental Surprise. This book is by an Israeli intelligence leader who, in the wake of the Yom Kippur War, writes the idea that there are some surprises, situational surprises, that you could kind of predict, and then there are fundamental surprises which you could not predict. And he talks about the 73 war being a fundamental surprise. The truth is a lot more complicated. In fact, and this is something we might want to talk about if we're thinking about contemporary operations, and we can talk about that in Q&A, there were plenty of warnings for the 73 war. And there were plenty of people who thought a war was coming. However, the all-source intelligence briefers, the people who sat at the top of the pyramid of intel, including the person who wrote this book, Zvi Leiner, had a concept that they were wedded to of what it would take for Egypt and Syria to go to war. And while all of the tactical, operational, and indeed strategic indicators were showing that war was coming, they would not move off their concept, despite other intelligence agencies assessing that war was coming. They were the gatekeepers to the prime minister and the general staff, and they prevented that intelligence from being shared. That said, eventually that intelligence did get through, and one of the key things is that Israel begins its mobilization the day before the war. This is an absolutely huge advantage and creates a major surprise for the Syrians and Egyptians who are expecting it to take multiple days. We can also talk about the idea of mobilization and the speed at which a country can mobilize as very relevant to the current Gaza situation. Another myth that I think Dr. Burke here is going to touch on is this idea that Israel was a NATO-style country fighting a Soviet-style country. And from there we could draw lessons about NATO equipment, NATO doctrine, and NATO technology. As I think I've already made clear, the Israeli military did not work like a NATO military. Its assumptions and cultures were radically different. But so was its technology. One of the armored divisions that is very successful in the fight in Sinai is entirely Soviet equipment. One of their battalions, known as White Bear Battalion, is an amphibious armored battalion made entirely of light amphibious Soviet armor that engages a Soviet-equipped heavy Egyptian division and manages to hold out. So we should have a note here that it's not a fight of NATO exactly versus Eastern Bloc equipment. And that should already start to color some of the lessons we may learn. The other thing is that the model of leadership was different. So when we look at the 73 war, we validate to an extent military professionalism. But that is not the model that the Israelis take. In fact, they validated at the time that the staff officers had failed, that the generals had failed, that military leadership at the higher levels had failed, and planning had failed. In fact, they validate in their minds that planning is not hugely worthwhile, and rather the combat innovation that happened on the field should take the brunt of it. Lessons that they'll bring to bear very successfully in the 1982 and subsequent wars. So, the lessons they take from it and the lessons we take seem strikingly different, and we're going to again have Dr. Burke talking about some of why that is. Some people look at this as an inherent failure of Arab militaries, that somehow the Arab militaries just failed because of who they were in their structures. This is not the case at all. They were quite successful and quite professional. They followed their doctrine accurately, but they were defeated. There are people who will look at the air power and say, well, the Egyptian offensive failed when it went outside its SAM's umbrella. You'll hear that over and over again, and that's in a lot of US military publications on it. The Egyptian offensive was stymied not by air power, but by superior use of armor. Almost all of the Egyptian armor is defeated by Israeli armor. So we could start to think about questions towards multi-domain operations and their relative value. Another one is this idea of the genius of Sadat. That Sadat knew he only needed a peace across the canal, he achieved that peace, and that was the only reason he fought the war. This is untrue. If you look at Sadat's objectives going into the war, they're really maximalist. They're going to put pressure on Israel to give up the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, and the Sinai, with no conditions attached to it. What he ends up with at the end of the war is that Israel will give up control of the Sinai, but he doesn't get that at the end of the war. He gets that 6 years later as part of a peace deal. And the precondition is that Egypt make peace, a lasting peace with Israel. In addition, that there will be a permanent US peacekeeping presence, so it actually ends up being US, Colombia, and Fiji, will maintain a permanent presence in Sinai, which sits there to this day. It's a multinational force and observers. And that Israel will have veto power over every single piece of equipment Egypt moves into the Sinai, an arrangement that exists to this day. And finally, the US will fund Israel to have a qualitative military advantage permanently over any of its neighboring states, a relationship that also continues to this day. So we can see that these are among the many, many, many myths. And I'm sure some of you recognize these myths and have been taught them or have read them before, that permeate our understanding of the 1973 war. And really, that is what this War Council is to help us understand. It's to help us have a flavor of the realities of the war that we're not talking about, the realities from which we as a contemporary force can learn lessons. So what are the panelists going to talk about? The first panelist up will be Dr. Eric Burke. Burke is going to talk about how the US, and I'm going to use this in the loosest possible terms, learned lessons from the war. So give us the basis of what happened. What are the lessons we think we learned and why? We're then going to move on to Dr. Tietzen Wisdom. She's going to talk about the regional perspective. One of the things we constantly miss, as I've alluded to, is that this is not an Egypt and Syria versus Israel war, that this is a regional war with regional actors who each come into it for their own reasons. And finally, Nate Jennings, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Nate Jennings, he's got too many titles to throw in here, will talk about some of his work on what lessons can the contemporary US Army learn. After that, we're going to go back and open it up for questions. I'm happy during Q&A to talk about some of these myths we've talked about, I've touched on, some more of what we can learn from it, some more of the details of the war if anyone's interested in those, and even to talk about the contemporary Gaza operations. I've been spending the last several days briefing various commands on those operations and ongoing, so that's actually more where my head is anyway right now. I'll also note that I am around tomorrow during the morning through lunchtime, and I'm happy to have, for anyone who has a class that would be relevant to you, or for any group who wants to get together to discuss it, a much more in-depth discussion on the current Gaza operations. I'm in regular touch with our colleagues in Israel ground forces and with some parts of the Israeli security establishment as they're going through this operation, so I'm very happy to discuss that then, or now, or both. Without further ado, because I was originally going to moderate and I'm really filling in for our absent Israeli colleagues, let me turn it over to Dr. Eric Burke to begin to talk about why we didn't learn lessons.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. We were told there were going to be thousands, like a Taylor Swift concert. But,
I think we've got the few in the crowd. Wait, that's the wrong sentence, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Storr, for that introduction. I'm going to tell a story that, well, I'm not going to tell a story that's been told many, many times, but I'm going to talk about a topic that has had a story told about it many, many, many times over. In fact, many of you who are in American military history classes will probably bump in at some point to the story of the Army's resurrection in the wake of the Vietnam War. And that is a narrative that has been told from the perspective, the retrospective perspective of about 1992, 1993, where the buck kind of stops at Desert Storm. And we look rearward and we say, hey, you know what? We did a really good job pulling out of that tailspin. And fortunately, we learned the right lessons. We drew a lot from other people's wars, other people's suffering. And fortunately, we were able to build a new professional all-volunteer force that was completely different from the hole that we were in 1973 when all of this started. What I'm going to try to suggest is that the narrative, when you take the following 20 or 30 years after 1991, things don't look quite so bright. And it is possible to read everything that happened through a very different lens in a way that I would argue is both far more accurate and far more relevant for our current state of affairs as the United States Army. Now, I consider myself a military historian, obviously, but I'm also a cultural historian. I'm interested first and foremost with shared ideas and beliefs and values and norms as they exist within military organizations and as they shape military organizations. And that's the context in which I'm going to talk about the Yom Kippur War. It's also the context in which I wrote about it. I am interested in the Yom Kippur War as what I call a surrogate for escapism. It facilitated the development of a culture of escapism within the United States Army. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, there's the Webster's definition right there, but escapism is essentially using something to distract from something you don't want to think about. I think everybody in the room probably knows that thing is the glaring war in Vietnam, or the glaring defeat in Vietnam, strategic reversal in Vietnam, unfortunate unpleasantness in Vietnam, however you want to refer to it. In 1973, it was pretty hard to ignore that things did not go the way that we or the Republic of Vietnam wanted them to go, and in 1975, the Republic of Vietnam was going to cease to exist. And that wasn't necessarily entirely our fault, as historians would tell you. but I think there are no historians who would tell you that the Army did everything right and things just didn't go our way despite all the things that we attempted to do. This is my forthcoming book. That's the shameless plug on that. But I'm going to tell you about why I have come to this conclusion and what I mean by escapism by working through this case study. This is the wrong clicker. That was a trick. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it's the right clicker. There we go. That's just delayed. There we go. So coming out of Vietnam, the Army did almost no official soul searching after the longest war in its history and the a tremendous strategic failure. Not that that would ever happen again. The 1975 BDM Corporation contracted report that the Army signed off on, it was begun earlier, several years earlier. A bunch of contractors sat down and they pulled in all of the evidence and they said, okay, well, our conclusion is that while American forces did a really good job at the tactical level in adapting to the kind of what we would call hybrid challenges of counterinsurgency and stability operations and direct action stuff. Ultimately, those things were too rarely actually tied to some sort of political instinct, some sort of strategic objective. Much of that was because they had to be balanced with what the South Vietnamese government wanted to do. We weren't, the sole actor on the field there. But ultimately, one of the biggest takeaways that BDM had was that our doctrine was too finely focused. It was too focused on finite direct action contingencies, and we needed to blow it up into a more broad or flexible doctrine that incorporated a lot of these ideas that we struggled with in Vietnam. And by and large, those are things that already had been happening in the Army over the course of the late 60s, and by 68, our capstone FM 100-5 included things like stability operations and what we would consider counterinsurgency for the first time in the Army's history. Now, at the same time, though, they're buying clubs, if you will, of cultural constellations within the Army. The first of which is termed the Never Again Club by its opponents in the Army. And the Never Again Club are mostly senior leaders who look at the situation and they say, we don't want any more Vietnams. It's called a new Never Again Club because the same group of people or similar people existed after Korea. And so we don't want any more limited wars. If you're going to call the Pentagon and say, send us somewhere, then don't hold our hands behind our back. We want to use everything in our capacity to win a war, to include nuclear weapons. No holds barred if we move on from here. And moreover, don't send us to anything like Vietnam, because that's not our job. That's not what we're designed to do. That's not what this force is supposed to do. Now, there's an anti-Never Again Club, people who are writing into Military Review at this time, and they're saying things like, well, hold on. Like, most of our history as an institution is filled with fighting these kinds of wars. Limited wars, counterinsurgency, chasing Indians around the frontier, building bridges, those types of things are what the Army has historically done. The big war stuff is rare. So maybe what we need is more in line with what BDM is saying. We need to change our training and try to prepare soldiers psychologically, morally, culturally for these more open-ended responsibilities and contingencies. Once again, very in line with BDM. Well, in 1973, Creighton Abrams, the chief of staff of the Army at the time, when they break apart Karnak at Fort Monroe and they create TRADOC and FORCECOM like we know now, he puts this guy, General William Depew, at the head of TRADOC. They're very close. He has a lot of respect for this man, commanded 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam. For a time, he was the chief of staff of operations for MACV. He is the closest thing to a card-carrying chieftain of the Never Again Club that existed in the Army in 1973. In his opinion, that's a direct quote of him up top there, regular U.S. troop units are peculiarly ill-suited for the purpose of securing operations where they must be in close contact with the people. In his opinion, COIN is an absolute waste of time. And not just COIN, but anything stability, anything foreign internal defense, anything other than fire missions. He described his time across in Normandy as escorting forward observers across France. That's how he thinks about war. It's how he thought about war in Vietnam. Vietnam he sees as an aberration rather than a fundamental challenge to how we think about conflict in general. Boy, this is touchy. There we go. So when he comes into the inaugural post of TRADOC in 1973, A lot of things are coalescing in the world, not only in the Army, but globally. As Dr. Stoyle talked about, I mean, in October, obviously, the Arab-Israeli conflict kicks off. But prior to that, General Depew had been on a tour where he gave talks at various locations to the extent that he thought that the Army really needed to get back in the saddle when it came to preparing to defend against some Soviet onslaught into Germany. There were all these reports, especially the Astoria Study Group report, that suggested that the Army was way behind the curve and had been spending way too much time on the counterinsurgency mission and the foreign internal defense mission, and had lost track of a lot of the Soviet developments technologically and tactically, and we needed to play a lot of catch up in order to get to that point. Talked a lot of things about the importance of anti-air nets, of missiles, anti-tank guided missiles, the importance of combined arms and convergence with combined arms, things that we're talking about now, and we were going to talk about in the immediate aftermath of Yom Kippur. General Depew and his acolytes were talking very much about months and even years before the Yom Kippur War ever kicked off, right? Well, when it does kick off, mind you, as I have underlined, there's no robust effort to study Vietnam at the same time. Him and his acolytes, men like General Don Starry, call it this is a quote, a marvelous excuse, don't tell that to the Israelis, for reviewing and updating our own doctrine, right? It is exactly the right kind of conflict at the right kind of moment for the Army to say, that's modern. That's what modern looks like. Don't look at the Vietnam stuff, that's over. Same year we pulled out of Vietnam, same year we switched from a draft-based all-volunteer Army. This is the kind of conflict that's on the horizon, and only this kind of conflict. I should correct, we don't send observers at the time, we send observers after the fact. In '74, we have an intel sharing agreement with the Israelis. Men among whom is General Don Starry go to Israel and they come back, and the things they say is, hey, you know what? This fits all of the paradigms that we had been thinking about prior, but it organizes them all into a neatly packed case study that we can use to now take, wait for it, suspense, if I can. Trying. Doing all I can. Okay. We can take to Congress. We can take to the purse holders. We can take to the American people. Oh, it's right there. I'm aiming over there. Need to zero this. To legitimate and leverage this event in order to accrue the budget and obtain the budget and acquisitions funds that we need to completely revamp the Army and redirect it in a completely different direction from Vietnam. General Depew talks about how we need to play catch up on modernization, how there's this, I love this, new lethality, we've never heard this before, new lethality, it's vastly more lethal, it's more complex, it's more lethal, it's more interactive than anything's ever been before. And we require highly trained and highly skilled combined arms teams, nothing like the draft, high on pot Army in 1968. Like we need a true professional all-volunteer force to achieve this, and most importantly, combined arms convergence, because of all of these new lethal interactive challenges that exist in Yom Kippur that don't exist in Vietnam, according to General Depew, contrary to things that he was saying months before the Yom Kippur War had ever even happened. But he wants to pull in all these lessons from these observers, and he wants to relate every single one of them to the new doctrine that he is going to write as the first head of Training and Doctrine Command. In the process of beginning to put together this new hierarchically organized doctrine that's going to start with the capstone, and then as it works its way down, each branch is going to write their own manuals for operations in infantry, cavalry, armor, you name it. But it's got to start at the top, because everything's going to cue off of that. It's like our new FM30, the version back then was the FM 100-5. And the discussion of who's going to write that and when seems to make sense that it should go to the first inaugural commander of the Combined Arms Center, General John Cushman. Problem is, John Cushman was an advisor in Vietnam. He's got brigade command experience, division command experience, and he's an MIT graduate. He's an academic. He's got a lot of academic bones in his body, which is very contrary to General Depew. When John Cushman and his staff prepare a draft of this new capstone doctrine, it says things like war is a thinking man's art. It has no traffic with rules. There's no supreme weapons. Vietnam teaches us that you have to be able to flex. You have to be broad and flexible and adaptable with all of your ideas, because you don't know what the major contingencies are going to be that the Army is deployed to. It's It's exceedingly concise. It's less than 100 pages long, and General Depew absolutely hates it. Every single page, throws the whole thing out, tells John Cushman to rewrite it. He refuses, and so General Depew says, okay, I'm going to write it with my team, which we're going to call the Boathouse Gang, because they're going to hang out in an ex-boathouse at Fort Monroe in order to do it. And he wants inviolable rules that are the principles of war that cannot be violated. He wants to emphasize step-by-step instructions, because soldiers, this is a General Depew quote, are not the smartest people, and they need step-by-step checklists in order to achieve the things that you expect them to do. And we must write the manuals that say how the weapon systems work that make our doctrine work moving forward. This is the Boathouse. These are extracts from the Boathouse Gang's new 76 FM 100-5. New lethality, modern weapons, and you see up there in the top right, the war in the Middle East in 1973 might well pretend the nature of modern battle. All of it. Everything to come is going to look like Yom Kippur. The only time the word Vietnam shows up in the manual, the 3 years after we left the longest war in our history, is saying that's not this. Vietnam's over, we're taking you out of the rice paddies, and we're dropping you off in Europe. Stability operations, everything that had been put from Vietnam into the Capstone Doctrine by '68, excised. Not in the manual anywhere. Everything is about this specific contingency for Western Europe. And then the rest of it looks like a graphic novel because there's so many illustrations. General Depew and the new TRADOC also established RTEP, which has been rightfully celebrated, because it takes the time-based training methods that the Army had and converts them into these checklists that General Depew loves, what we think of as the mission essential task lists, where every unit in the Army has, these are the things that you have to be able to achieve in order to be certified, in order to go down range, so on and so forth. That's great as a training mechanism. The problem, though, is that those lists have to be calibrated to a specific contingency. And when you have a highly specific doctrine at the top, that means that everything else under it, under this system, is only calibrated for that specific contingency and nothing else. And therefore, when you train an army like that, and you professionalize an army like that, and you acculturate an army like that, so long as the contingencies that you're actually sending them to look like that, or are similar to that, you are likely to meet with profound levels of success. The problem about war is that it changes organically. It transforms. You have no say as the United States Army as to what you're going to be deployed toward. That's Congress and the President's purview. You can design a force that is good for the things you think you're going to be sent for, but if your doctrine doesn't allow for any adaptability, you're going to struggle mightily and costly in the process, which then loops back around toward doctrine reformation. Almost done. Until, in fact, we'll move forward. Look at that. By the time we get to about 2014, 2015, our doctrine is beginning to look far more like 1968 and less like 1976. That's as a result of all of the low-intensity conflicts and counterinsurgency operations and foreign internal defense that we did all through the 80s and 90s and early 21st century, contrary to how our doctrine starts out in 1976. After the conclusion, I will say, of the war in Afghanistan, we begin to see a lot of things that look a whole lot like deja vu. Right? These are extracts from the 2022, the brand new 3.0, talking about pivoting. Everybody's heard about pivoting from decades of counterinsurgency to the large-scale combat operations battlefield. And Ukraine is increasingly beginning to smell a lot like Yom Kippur. It's very similar in a lot of different ways. And the problem here is dichotomy. We are still thinking, because of the culture laid down by General Depew and his followers, in terms of you can only prepare for LSCO or you can prepare for everything else. You can't prepare for both simultaneously. We have to make a cognitive break with the Middle East. We got to get rid of the hybrid stuff. We got to get off the Iraq and Afghan map sheets. These are unattributed quotations from general officers, I should say, that I intentionally have not attributed. And there's challenges beyond any the US Army has ever faced. Does that sound familiar? It's utilizing a conflict, one kind of conflict, that distracts from spending time on something we don't want to talk about and we don't want to think about because we're tired of it, and it's not the kind of conflict we want to think about anyway. But the truth of the matter is that you have to prepare for all of it, right? All of it. There are no limits, regardless of how hard that sounds. You've got to walk and shoot guns simultaneously. Otherwise, the enemy is going to force you to do which of those two you don't want to do. And as the conflict in Gaza has suggested, as well as the conflict in Ukraine, as well as our ongoing low-intensity conflicts, all of this stuff is modern. It's all going on contemporaneously. It will continue to go on contemporaneously. And you can't pick and choose which one you think looks most like what you want the future to be, because you're going to be engaged in all of it if you're going to be an institution as global and as relevant as the United States Army. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
It'll be easier if you go first.
Next up, Dr. Kate Tietzen-Wisdom will talk to us about the Iraqi forces and the Iraqi policy as part of this as a regional conflict. And again, we expect and hope to take a lot of questions, so what we're giving you is a sample platter of pieces that we can talk about in the questions, about lessons learned, about the legacies. And so just as Dr. Tietzen-Wisdom is talking about one of the regional actors, we can talk about more of this during question and answer. Over to you.
Thanks, Jacob. So good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Jacob and Max for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you all today. Today I want to talk about Iraq's role in the October 1973 war, and I want to preface this. I know Iraq doesn't come to mind when you think about this war. Heck, the North Koreans apparently decided to have a little venture there as well. We tend to think of the USSR, United States, Syria, Egypt, Israel, but the Iraqis were there. They didn't do very well, but it still matters, and there are larger implications of that. The key thing with this, though, is that this war fundamentally changed the dynamic in the Middle East and the relationships and the power structure between Arab states. And we see a lot of those consequences today, and that's what I want to speak about that today. So, I want to make a quick note. A lot of my research is derived from the captured Ba'ath Party records. These were captured in 2003 in Baghdad. These are actual photos in the basement. They were found basically abandoned. They are in Stanford, California at the Hoover Institution. They're also in DC, if anyone's looking for a research project. Talk to me about this. But the hope is that a lot of the sources on this war from the Iraqi perspective are dicey. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. They're problematic for multiple reasons. There was a huge hope that these records would help to shine some light on the Iraqis in the 1970s. Unfortunately, interviews with former Ba'athist officials indicated that when the party ran out of storage room, they just started burning stuff. So for historians, that makes me want to cry and scream. But the records that did survive kind of give us a better insight into the consequences of this and how this impacted both the party, the Ba'ath Party, and Iraq, more broadly speaking. So we may not know exactly the military component of this, like tactics, planning, yet. There is more still to be found, but let me give you a little insight today. So, all right, so as historians, we do love a timeline, and I think it's important to keep this in mind as we talk about Iraq in 1973. This was not the first time that the Iraqis and Israelis had come to blows. Iraqi army units had fought in 1948, while they sat out of the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Again, this is largely due to the Iraqi monarchy at the time was very, very pro-United Kingdom. They did participate in the 1967 war, deploying about 15,000 soldiers. However, in all these conflicts, the Iraqi army performed poorly, with several formations wiped out by the IDF. There's another thing to keep in mind. Iraq was preoccupied with other foreign policies besides Israel. The Iraqi state had just finished fighting an almost 9-year insurgency with its own Kurdish populations in the north. The Iraqi army units there set aside their armored vehicles for lighter vehicles, and their Iraqi Air Force was able to carry out aerial bombardments, uncontested aerial bombardments of those populations. And this is going to show up in 1973 in the Golan Heights. They're going to learn the wrong lessons, like Dr. Burke kind of pointed out here. Furthermore, Iran and Iraq had several border disputes, and they had actually cut off relations, diplomatic relations, in 1971. The Shah, for his part, was arming and assisting the Kurds, literally just to spite the Iraqis. There's not a lot of love with the Kurds in Iran and Iraq. It was to get at the Iraqi state. In 1972, The Iraqis had signed a friendship pact with the Soviet Union, but to their dismay, Moscow also signed a similar accord with Damascus around the same time. And while Iraq certainly relied on Soviet support and assistance, it was no stooge, and it was already viewing the Soviets with suspicion and analyzing the Kremlin's ulterior motives. So one of the things here is with the sourcing issues, there's a couple issues within the historiography, and so let me be very quick, give you a quick rundown of this. One, leading up to October 1973, the first question is, when was Iraq told of the invasion, the plan to invade by the Syrians and the Egyptians? So the Iraqis were not completely oblivious that something was going on. Soviet and Iraqi media sources both indicate that the Egyptians had visited Iraq multiple times to gauge their interest, and this includes the Egyptian chief of staff who visited Iraq in the spring of 1972 and 1973. The Iraqis, for their part, took the time to complain that they were too busy with Iran and the Kurds. However, Western and Soviet sources indicate that Sadat had actually asked the Kurds to cease military operations against the Ba'athist state if war broke out with Israel. And this happened in spring of 1973. So they knew something was going on, they just weren't read in on it. Two, when was Iraq told the invasion was unfolding? So there are some sources that suggest that the Syrian President Hafez al-Assad had called Baghdad on the eve of the battle to share details, and that he did so only begrudgingly. Not because he didn't want to share in the glory of this victory, this soon-to-be victory in their mind, but to secure any backup if it was needed. Others suggest that the Iraqis only found out after hostilities had broken, and they actually got news from Western sources that war had broken out, and that they were that late to the game. Third, when did the Syrians ask for help? There are some disputes exactly when the Syrians asked for help, the day of, a couple days after. I don't want to go too far in the weeds of that because the Iraqi records aren't clear. If they were there, they were burned. But Saddam is alleged to have told the Syrian envoy to Iraq that if tanks had wings, they would arrive today. So the Iraqis were late, but they immediately responded and ordered their deployment of 3 divisions. And this includes 2 armored and 1 mechanized, about 60,000 soldiers to the Golan Heights. 2 Iraqi Air Force squadrons had been in Egypt since May of 1973. Again, further supporting the idea that the Iraqis probably had some sort of idea something was going on. And then 6 other squadrons were sent into the Golan Heights. All total, this counted for about 2/3 of the Iraqis' armed forces and 3/4 of its air force. So this is a huge deployment for a military that has been divided between the Kurds and dealing with Iran. So Iraqi formations actually show up on between 10 and 11 October. The first to arrive is the 12th Armored Brigade of the 3rd Iraqi Army Division, and it spearheaded the movement into the Golan Heights. Now, this is where things start going, get a little more complicated for the Iraqis because the 3rd Division's other 2 brigades, the 8th and the 6th, had to travel on tracks for 400 kilometers to get from Iraq to Syria. So if any of you have any armor or have been on tracks or have maintenance or logistics, you're probably internally screaming, thinking about that, but 400 kilometers on tanks is a long way and it's going to take a long time to get there. The 12th Armored Brigade engaged with the IDF on 12 October, but there are immediate issues in battle. There's limited coordination with the Syrians. There's reports of Iraqi commanders showing up at the battlefield and the Syrian commander being like, all right, this is all yours, I'm out, and withdrawing and leaving the Iraqis behind. One Iraqi unit gets caught in a minefield that had been laid by the Syrians, and when they try to radio in for help, they realize that the radios are not connected, and so they're basically stuck. Iraqi aircraft did not have friend or foe systems, so they're getting shot down by the Syrians. The Iraqi Air Force had also been focused on a guerrilla war in the northern Iraq. They were not used to air-to-air combat with the IDF, who schwacked them. I'm not sure if that's a doctrinal term, but there's a lot of schwacking that happens here. In total, the 12th Armored Brigade loses 20 tanks on one day, and not to be outdone, on the very next day, the 8th Armored Brigade that eventually does show up, it gets ambushed. Ambushed, or it walked into a trap. Tomato, tomato at this point. It loses 80 tanks and is virtually non-existent after this. And it's ironic that after the war, Jordan had actually commissioned official history from a retired Pakistani general who wrote that the Iraqis had launched an anticipated, stereotyped, and narrow front attack against a 4-mile wide open end of an IDF box trap. And even this Pakistani general said that was probably not the best idea. And so in the end, there are about 870 Iraqis killed, 73 missing, 271 wounded. They lost 26 planes and 111 tanks. One of the key things to take, I can talk more about this in the Q&A, is that there's this myth that's born in the Iraqi military that it saved Damascus. That if they had not got schwacked during this, that the Iraqis would have marched into Damascus and taken over in Syria, and Syria would have fallen. It's a big stretch. One, it's questionable if the IDF even wanted to take over all of Damascus. Two, the main line of effort had shifted to the Sinai, but this becomes a big thing, and Baghdad uses this against the Syrians again and again, poking them in the eye, like, we saved you in 1973, and it's a stretch. I can go more into that in the Q&A. So, a couple of things, just because we're short on time here, I want to touch on. So, how they shaped this Cold War after. The Iraqis, again, we know this from the Iraqi documents, learned that after this war, the Kremlin is never going to favor Iraq, that they always will be secondary. The Soviet Union now favors Syria. It looks at Egypt, thinks it is weak, not worthy of all of its military support, so Syria becomes the jewel in the Middle East. They also know that the Kremlin is not all powerful. The Kremlin was, suffice to say, freaking out during this war and wanted the Arab states after the ceasefire to cool down the language, slow it down, and actually told the Syrians, if you don't tone things down, we're going to stop arming you, stop helping you, etc. The Syrians, and this is all detailed in Iraqi intelligence reports, the Syrians said, fine, we'll go to China. To which the Kremlin said, whoa, we were just joking. Never mind, it's all good now. And so the Iraqis learned that the Soviet Union may be the superpower in the region, but you can call their bluff as well. Last thing I want to talk about, I can come back to this in Q&A, in the region, how this shaped the region. The Iraqis will use this war, that they were able to supersede Arab rivalries, that they defended the Palestinians and Arabs from Israel. They will use this war to catapult into the mantle of leadership in the Arab world. And they will do this not necessarily because they are anti-Semitic, they're anti-Zionist, they're anti-Israel, but more so despite Syria. And doing this, they will also start deploying militias to Palestine, Lebanon, Israel, that they will gradually lose control over. And I can go more into that in Q&A, but a lot of what we're seeing today with a foreign power arming, assisting, planning with local militia groups, the Iraqis are doing this after 1973 as well. So short in time, but can go into more of that in Q&A, but thank you so much for your paying attention.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. Max, Jacob, I can't say enough how appreciative I am to have you guys bring me here. Let me just start by saying this connection with West Point, with CGSC is important, and that's another thing I appreciate is the opportunity to bring our institutions together. For many of your instructors, my classroom is the next stop. So the captains, the majors here, they're going to go on to Leavenworth to get that education and become division staff officers and commanders. And so the more opportunity we can bring these institutions together, the better for the enterprise. So what I want to speak on today is kind of the relevancy of the Yom Kippur War for the Army in this particular moment. So agreeing with Eric, an Army has to do all things, ready for all things. It is also true that LSCO, high-intensity combat, is a particular requirement with high consequences. So similar to how General Starry, trade-off, were looking at this war 20, 30 years ago to inform the evolution of airland battle, we're at another moment where we're adopting a new operational concept. We're adopting and evolving a new division force structure. And so I think it compels another relook of this conflict for new insights. Some will be familiar, some actually could be quite new in this modern era where drones are scrambling the combined arms effort in Ukraine, by both sides, I might add. So I just want to start with Army's refocusing. That's an oft-quoted phrase on LSCO. It may be overstatement a little bit. We've always kept that focus, but we're really looking at it now as we put the coin wars in the rear view, and we're actually following word and rhetoric with action. We're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're reorganizing the divisions, new focus on fires, on recon, on making the division headquarters the Combined Arms Integrator. So I think, again, it is time for, it is worth a look at the Yom Kippur War in that context. So multi-domain operations, published last year in 3.0, our capstone doctrinal concept. And in that frame, it's worth using the tenets of MDO to look at the Yom Kippur War. So we got agility, convergence, depth, and endurance. All of those tenets we can see on the battlefields of the Sinai, on the Golan. We can see them, how both sides fulfilled them, did not fulfill them, created opportunity, and responded to disadvantaged circumstances. So the first one I want to start with is agility. We can look at one division in particular. This is the 162nd Reserve Armored Division that ends up being the IDF's breakout division in Africa to end the war decisively on favorable terms for Jerusalem. And so this division, in just the space of a few days, it reconstitutes after losing 40 to 45% of its armor. It transitions to assisting with the crossing, moving bridges, fighting at the Chinese farm. It then fights another major tank battle in the Egyptians' final counterattack on the Sinai side of the canal. It crosses over, conducts a passage of lines while in contact, and only then begins the breakout in enemy territory. And it's going to fight in sprint all the way down to Suez City to complete the isolation of the Egyptian Third Army. So imagine the amount of task, retask, unexpected task that this division is negotiating, all in real time, all on radio, learning how to re-engage with the Egyptian Air Force and apply joint fires that had been disaggregated in the first week of the war. And so this idea of battlefield agility is exemplified by that division, but also by other units, by Egyptian units in their, what I would consider masterpiece of a crossing, by other Israeli divisions as they fight through adversity. So this is something that the US Army can look for in the Yom Kippur War, because things will not go as planned. We're seeing that in Ukraine right now. All kinds of unexpected challenges to maneuver, to fires. What does the transparent battlefield mean for operational surprise? And so I think that tenet is something we can look at. The second one, convergence. This is an aspect of joint integration, and in some ways you could look at the Yom Kippur War as a story of the IDF on losing the convergence of its air and ground forces in the first week, and then fighting to figure it out how to get that back. When the Israeli forces force a crossing of the canal, one of the first things the tanks do on the other side is they start shooting SAM's batteries. So this is that joint asymmetry that all forces look for in warfare. Imagine main battle tanks using SA-6s for gunnery practice, essentially what was happening. And that creates a gaping hole in the Egyptian integrated air defenses, and the Israeli air can get back in the fight. And they start to restore that air-ground integration, that cooperation, and break out with maneuver. That is something we're seeing challenged on all kinds of battlefields in the last couple of years. We see it in the Nagorno-Karabakh, where Armenia has had many problems. We saw it with Russia last year in their invasion. Huge problems. We're seeing it now, frankly, with Ukraine on the Zaporizhzhia front. Very difficult to maneuver in the face of those fires when you don't have air superiority. Okay? Third, we have depth. The Israelis have to project combat power into enemy territory to end the war on favorable terms. This happens in the Golan, where they push farther out towards Damascus. This happens in Africa. They force a crossing the canal and have to encircle the enemy field armies. These are really corps. And so that requirement is undergirded by a necessity to do contested gap crossing. This is something our Army is focused on. It's long been one of the most challenging kind of training problem sets, and it requires a combined arms and joint integration at a high level to accomplish. The Israelis get it done by sequencing 4 types of river crossing elements: rubber boats, motorized rafts, pontoon bridge, and a giant roller bridge. And by sequencing them, they barely get it done because they're taking fire the entire time. They suffer dozens of engineers KIA at the crossing. They lose more than a dozen tanks toppling into the canal because they're under fire from artillery and air the entire time. So figuring out that sequencing, that redundancy, what is required to do this? Again, we've seen this challenge in Ukraine. We're crossing rivers on a transparent battlefield that is covered by drones and precision fires is proving to be very difficult. Finally, endurance. So I mentioned in the first week of the war, the IDF takes a beating on both fronts. I want to look again at the Sinai front, suffering about 40 to 45% losses in armor, maybe 40, 50 tier 1 aircraft loss. And so then, in as much as it's a story of figuring out how to do combined arms warfare, joint integration, it's also a story of reconstitution at the division level, something the US Army hasn't had to deal with in some time. The Israeli divisions, they aren't allowed to pull back out of contact to reconstitute. They do it in the second week of the war while in contact, receiving new men, new equipment, pulling back damaged tanks, fixing them, and they have to fully reconstitute to go back on offense. This is one of the main things, dealing with attrition, probably an Achilles heel of the US Army, and we have a lot to learn from how both the Israelis and I'll say the Egyptians negotiated that particular challenge. So a lot there, a lot to look at as our Army adopts MDO, a new doctrinal concept, operating concept, and while we would never look for direct lessons, every war is different. None of us will fight at the Suez Canal in '73. There are some patterns we can look at. There's some insights that can be taken as the U.S. Army increases its own readiness for large-scale combat operations. Thank you.
As we transition to questions and discussion, some things that popped out to me from each presentation that I thought were very interesting. From Dr. Burke's presentation, the idea and that Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jennings, do you prefer Dr. Lieutenant Colonel or Lieutenant Colonel Doctor?
Has to be Lieutenant Colonel.
Fair enough. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jennings brought out here is this idea that we take lessons about combined arms, joint fires integration, and the use of fires. Notably, the IDF fires light throughout the whole war. Fires are a de-emphasized part of its operations and remain so to this day, viewing them as much more a strategic level asset. In combined arms, the IDF does have to relearn how to do this during the war and promptly forgets it again immediately after, and relearns it again and again and again. And with the idea of joint integration, right, one of Deploy's biggest parts is air-land battle, the kind of headlines in the name there, that it's about the air providing close air support and air interdiction. The IDF model throughout the '73 war is to validate that the ground forces owe opening the skies to the Air Force, and the Air Force takes care of air interdiction. They stay light on close air support as a concept, and to this day lack a lot of what we think about a robust close air support structure. So I think Dr. Burke's point is very well validated, that when we took the lessons we were already thinking of, and not the lessons the IDF takes from it, which to me is a very interesting conversation about how do we study a foreign war and how do we make sure that our lessons are intact. To Dr. Tietzen's point, I think the idea of great power and regional alignment becomes really interesting. As we tend to think about people lined up, and we can hear this discourse right now in China, you're either lined up one direction or another direction, rather than the complicated interaction even within those alliances. And then finally, to Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Jennings' point, got to get it all in one breath, the idea of reconstitution and flexibility becomes absolutely the key task, and arguably what the Israelis do so far better than their adversaries during that war, which will allow them to gain momentum and take the victory. And so how do we think about that going forward into MDO? some thoughts I had of key points that jumped out at me, but really we're here to talk to you all, and so over to you.
So we have 10 minutes for questions, and as I said, I think at least Dr. Stoyle will be available tomorrow, and I think some of the other panelists might as well, but no, maybe just Dr. Stoyle. But please briefly state your questions so we can get in as many as we can.
And we also don't have anything immediately after on the schedule, so we're happy to do afterwards questions as well.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Dr. Burke. Talking about RTEP and Mission Essential Tasks post-Vietnam, you said that Army units now are transitioning to division-level fight. You said that maneuver unit has to be ready to fight not only the large-scale combat operations, but coin operations, potentially amphibious operations, dense urban operations. So how do you train a brigade or a division to fight all of those fights simultaneously? Specifically looking at, for Mission Essential Tasks, the culminating brigade level certification is JRTC or NTC rotation. So how do we incorporate all of those into a single, or not a single, CTC rotation to make sure that all of our combat units are ready for all of the potential fights?
Sure, it's $1 million question, right? Fortunately, the Capstone Doctrine, especially the new 3.0, especially with the 2017 inclusion of consolidated gains, acknowledges the requirement of every unit on the field to be able to do most of the things that we consider to be, the nuts and bolts of COIN, of stability operations, of literally anything that connects with the political instate in the rear area, or setting things up for the rear area if you're on the fly. Ultimately, the onus to that is going to fall to echelon upon echelon of individuals who have to make the call of what is the political objective that I am likely to be deployed to do. And in the 80s and 90s, we really did a really good job of adjusting the CTCs in a way that we included exigencies and contingencies along those lines with the normal kind of LISCO operations that we were trying to prepare units for. How do we take, say, in the 80s when we're sending a unit to El Salvador or Somalia or whatever, how do we take an NTC or a JRTC rotation and then breathe in some stuff that is a little more on the messy side of it? Now, how you do it on a unit-to-unit level, that's going to be up to commanders. It's going to be up to the folks running NTC and JRTC, and it's got to be calibrated for each specific scenario. But big ideas, culturally, the first step is training soldiers at every echelon to understand that your responsibilities as a soldier or as an officer include all of this stuff that we don't spend as much time talking about. It's okay and important to look at capability gaps and say we've got to shore up these shortcomings and things that we haven't thought about in a long time. But it's not okay to say we're going to do that and we're not going to think about this other stuff at all because it's unpleasant to think about or because we just don't have time. Because if you don't think about it, the enemy is going to think about it, regardless of what your mission actually is. Even if you're successful, as we learned in 03, if you're successful with the access problem through your LISCO maneuver operations, you're going to end up doing the other stuff in the rear area, whether you like it or not.
Thanks.
Yeah, question for the panel. You talk a lot about how the Israeli army was able to reconstitute and kind of reconsolidate. But I was just curious what you think what contributed to the overall Israeli failure in the early days of the war? Because recently I read an article that says that a strict adherence to Israeli doctrine kind of hindered them, at least in the initial pass of the war. So I was just kind of curious what y'all thought of that.
So I think I'll jump in on that one. Israel has a very complicated relationship with doctrine in that it largely doesn't. They don't, on the whole, believe in doctrine. And while there are bodies in their headquarters who are responsible for writing doctrine, you will be hard-pressed to find commanders who have read it or know it terribly well at all. And that's even more true in the reserve. So I don't think it's a strict adherence to doctrine. I really think a lot of that failure happens to that concept. And this goes to one of the myths. The idea that the Israelis didn't really have a counter for the SAMS threat or for the ATGM threat. The problem was each of their counters had been developed in an individual service element agnostic to the conditions of the war. So the Air Force had developed a counter to SAMs. It was a very complicated series of air operations to disintegrate the A2AD threat. However, as the Syrians break through in the Golan Heights, those operations are canceled partway through, and the Air Force is sent to do air interdiction inside the A2AD bubble on the Golan Heights because the threat is so great there, and they lose a lot of their aircraft, and frankly, they lose the capability to deal with that SAM threat. At the same time, they said it's okay, we don't need to deal with it because the armor has it, and the Army will have it. Well, at the same time, the Army was looking to the Air Force and said, hey, the ATGM threat, we can deal with it, we have our own way to deal with it, a series of tactics, but really we're okay because the Air Force has our back on this one. And the Air Force will take it. And so one of it is it's rock, paper, scissors, relying on each side throwing the right sign. Well, what happens when they're busy with something else? And so the breaking of combined arms, the breaking of joint arms becomes the issue. But all of that is facilitated by two things. One, the US refusal to greenlight a preemptive strike, which the Israelis had asked for, so that's on the diplomatic and strategic level. And two, that initial intelligence processing and failure. And I don't want to say intelligence failure, because intelligence was saying all of the right things, right? It's a dissemination failure at the top level of the intelligence structures. So that doesn't work. Where the Israelis do fight according to their doctrine, so there's one fort on the fortified observation posts. These are not forts, by the way, if you hear Bar-Lev line, it's not a line of fortifications, they're hidey holes, you can't fight them. Where they are able to fight according to their doctrine there, they actually hold out for the entirety of the war, right? Where they are able to fight on the Golan Heights according to their doctrine, they hold out successfully. And finally, in Sinai, when they can have the fight they intended, i.e. armor against armor, it works really well. The problem, however, is they couldn't put themselves in the forward line, and so we should think about that part of intelligence, especially for any of you, any cadets who are going to go to the two side of the house and the intel side of the house. The responsibility of the briefer and the gatekeeping nature of the briefer is really, really an important lesson that comes out of here. I know that basically completely upended the article instead by saying it doesn't rely on doctrine. I apologize to whoever that wrote that article, but I think the doctrine isn't the issue at all.
Thank you.
I've had Israeli friends who have said that the past week was worse than the Yom Kippur War. What is their perspective? How are they seeing? What is feeding to that perception that they have?
So I guess, I'll head to that one again. So a couple of things. First of all, the Yom Kippur War, for the most part, was seen as remote. The bloody theater, although the Syrian theater is incredibly bloody and is a huge threat to the main part of Israel, they're able to turn that theater around very, very quickly. The main part of the fighting in their mind is Sinai, which is remote at that period. Second thing is there weren't a lot of civilian casualties in the 73 war, whereas the bulk of casualties from the Hamas attacks have been civilian. And then finally, the level of shock, I think, is very different to have someone come into your house and murder your family versus a war that begins on a front that's fought by soldiers. And I think the last piece of this is although the Israelis are loath to say this themselves, there is a lot of Holocaust memory coming into this. So where you've seen piles of kids, where you've seen people being burned alive, where you've seen people being lined up and shot into pits, where you've seen separations, people pulling kids away as they separate the mothers and the kids to do exactly as horrible as you can imagine things, right? That triggers a different part of historical memory and culture than the 73 war did. So that's the short answer of a longer answer on perception and culture.
I think we are about out of time, and I know some of you have places to be at 1400 or shortly after. So I want to thank our panel. I know they will all be available for anybody who can stay after right now, and thank you all for coming.